Fudayl, he was astonished. He said, where is he? Where is this man? We have to go see him. And so Ibn Mubarak, he said, not now, but like inshallah, I'm working on it. We'll get to meet him, right? We'll get to be in his presence. And so the next morning, Ibn Mubarak, he prayed Fajr. And he went to the house that he saw the slave was in, and over there he was greeted by an old man who recognized him. He said, oh, welcome, Assalamu alaikum, what do you need? What can I do for you? Right? And Ibn Mubarak, he said, look, I'm in need of a slave. And then the old man, he was happy. He said, oh my God, I have a lot of slaves. I have a lot of servants that you could choose from and buy whichever you want. And so he called a big, strong guy and he said, look at this one. This one, he'll help you and he'll be of good to you. And so Ibn Mubarak said, no, I have no need for this one. And he kept bringing out servant after servant until Ibn Mubarak, he saw the person who made the dua. And he started tearing up. He started tearing up. And so the old man, he looked at him and said, you want this one? Ibn Mubarak said, yes. He said, there's no way I can sell him to you. Ibn Mubarak said, why? What's going on? He said, because I see the presence in the house, his presence, I see it as a blessing. This particular slave, his presence blesses my household. And I see that. And he said, he doesn't cost me anything too. And my heart, I fell in love with the slave. And so he said, Ibn Mubarak, he was very interested. And so he asked him, where does he eat from? And then he said, oh, he sells his own stuff and he buys his own food. And he tells him, he says, the other boys, they tell me that he doesn't really mix in with them and that he's busy with himself, by himself, working on himself, and he doesn't sleep long nights. And so Ibn Mubarak, he was very smart, right? He said, do I go back to Fudayl and Sufyan al-Thawri, another giant, and tell them that you said no? This is what they want. And so the old man, he finally, he gave in. And he said, look, you coming to my house is a blessing as it is. Just have him for whatever price you want. And so he bought the slave. And as they were walking back to his residence, the slave, he looked at him and he said, Sayyid, he said, Master. And look at what Ibn Mubarak, he said. He said, Labbaik. He said, I'm at your service. What do you need? And so the slave, he said, please don't say at your service. Don't say at your service to me. For the slave is the one who should be at the service of his master. And so he tells him, he said, Mada turid ya habibi, right? Like, what do you want, my beloved? What do you want, my beloved? And he said, look, I'm physically weak. I don't have the strength to serve you, right? And you had other options. So why'd you choose me? And then he said, Ibn Mubarak, he said, La araka Allahu takhdumuni abada. He said, may Allah never see you serving me. What I plan to do with you is I plan to free you, and then I plan to purchase you a house and get you married, and then after that I'll serve you myself. Again, this was Ibn Mubarak talking to a slave whose dua got answered. He said, I will serve you myself. And so this young man, he started crying. And so Ibn Mubarak, he said, why are you crying, right? Well, what's going on? I told you I'm going to give you everything, right? And so he said, you didn't do that except that because you saw how I communicated with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you saw my communication with Allah, and then you decided to come approach me. If it wasn't for that, you would have never approached me, right? And now that you know about my relationship with Allah, everyone else will know about it. And I don't like that, right? And they continued walking until they passed by a masjid. And the servant, he said, let's stop here. Can I just go pray? I have some prayer that I owe, and I want to do it here. And so Ibn Mubarak, he said, let's continue walking. My house is right down the street. He said, no, please, I insist. I want to come to the masjid. I want to just make up these 2 rak'at. I don't like to delay my salah. So he said, fine, no problem. And so they entered. And the slave, he prayed 2 rak'at. And Ibn Mubarak, he says, he looked at me and he said, "Oh, Abu Abdul Rahman, do you need anything from me? I leave you in Allah's protection." He said, "Astawdi'uka Allah." And so Ibn Mubarak, he was confused. He said, "Wait, where are you going? Right, where are you headed to?" And he said, "I'm going on a long journey." And so Ibn Mubarak, he said, "Where?" And then the slave, he said, "To the hereafter." And so Ibn Mubarak, he started crying. He said, "Please, let me enjoy your company. Let me enjoy your company a bit more." And listen to the slave's response. He said, "Life was only sweetened when my interaction was only with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when my communication with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and my relationship with Him was completely private. Now that you know, others will know. And I don't want that. I have no need for that. I don't want to be famous. I don't want the house. I don't want to get married. I don't want to be free." Right? And he went down on his face and he said, "Ya Allah, take me to you in this moment, as-sa'a, as-sa'a." And he passed away. And Ibn Mubarak, he says, "I came near to him and I found him dead. And so we prayed janazah, and he said, Wallahi," Ibn Mubarak, he comments, he says, "Wallahi, I never remembered him except that a long sadness would envelop me and that the dunya would become so insignificant in my eyes whenever I remember the slave." Right? So now, taking 2 steps back, the point I wanted to focus on was the slave himself and his relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what made his relationship so special? What did he have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that other people didn't, right? He made one dua right away and it got answered, right? He had a very close and intimate relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this status is very, very well known. This status is called al-wilaya, right? When a person becomes a wali of Allah, he becomes a close, intimate companion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And who can attain this status? Who can be a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Who can be a wali? Or is this only limited to the 1% of Muslims? Is this an exclusive, a VIP only club in Islam? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Any one of us can become a wali of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, brothers and sisters. And the awliya of Allah, they are everywhere. Wallahi, they are everywhere, but they are hidden. And they will not tell you, right? So they don't ruin that special bond between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because once pride gets involved in the equation, everything is ruined, right? And Ali radiallahu anh, he said, Allah has hidden 2 things amongst His people: His pleasure in His good deeds and His awliya. So the awliya are alive and well and they're living amongst us, brothers and sisters. Now, the only question to ask is how? How can we be from those whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves? And how can we attain the special status in Islam, the status of wilaya, and to become awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gives us a very, very clear and concise roadmap on how we can achieve this state and how we can achieve this status. In a hadith Qudsi where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, "Man aada li waliyan faqad adhantuhu bil harb." He said, whoever so acts with hostility towards a wali of mine, towards a close, intimate servant of mine, then I will declare war against him. And He says, وَمَا تَقَرَّبَ إِلَيَّ عَبْدِي بِشَيْءٍ أَحَبَّ إِلَيَّ مِمَّا افْتَرَضْتُهُ عَلَيْهِ. He said, I will indeed declare war against him. Nothing endures my servant to me more than doing of what I have made obligatory upon him to do. And then He says, وَلَا يَزَالُ عَبْدِي يَتَقَرَّبُ إِلَيَّ بِالنَّوَافِلِ حَتَّى أُحِبَّهُ. And He says, and my servant continues to draw nearer to me and closer to me through nawafil, through voluntary acts, until I love him, so that eventually I love him. Right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how He starts this off is simply amazing. Right? When you have a rich friend, you have 2 friends, one is rich, one is poor. The poor friend, he shows off his rich friend to the others. He's proud of his rich friend, right? But in this case, And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, wallahi al-mathal al-a'la, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the ghani and we're the fuqara. Yet He's showing us off. He said, whoever so hurts or acts with hostility towards a close servant, a wali of mine, I'll declare war against him. This is how He starts it off. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. And Ibn al-Qayyim, he says, how many nations have been protected or destroyed because of a wali from them or against them? Because of a wali from them or against them. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, after this amazing introduction, He lays out the path on how we can attain His love. And the first step is, He talks about the obligatory acts that He made fara'id on us. He made wajib on us to do. He said, my servants, they continue to do what I told them to do, right? And I love that about them. My servants continue to do what I told them to do, and I love that about them, right? You do not come close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with anything more beloved to Him than what was made wajib for us, brothers and sisters. So the first point to start off with is salah. Salah is the first ibadah we should start off with. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, the salatu mi'rajul mu'min. The salah is the mi'raj for a mu'min. Mi'raj literally translates to ascend and to go up. So you want that ascension? Pray, right? Sujood is the only physical thing you do where your heart is above your brain, right? And the Prophet ﷺ, he told us and he instructed us a lot on salah, right? So pray on time and make sure your prayers are perfect, right? The Prophet was asked, which deed is dearest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? He said, as-salatu ala waqtiha. He said, praying on time. So that's the first part. Obligatory acts, whether it's salah, whether it's fasting, whether it's doing zakah, whether it's being good to your parents, good to your neighbors, everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded us to do them and focus on them. And we want to perfect the obligatory worship by doing it with itqan, sincerity and consistency, to the point where we start tasting the sweetness of it. And once we start tasting the sweetness of it, we'd want more, right? We'd want more. And what more do we want? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says this in the next part, the voluntary acts of worship, right? The voluntary acts of worship. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, my servant continues drawing nearer to me with nawafil. And notice how He says He continues drawing nearer to me. It's a process. We'll get to that in a later part, inshallah, right? So what does this mean? It means praying sunnah, fasting outside of Ramadan, praying tahajjud, remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? All of these voluntary acts that could get you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, do them one by one. We got the obligatory stuff down, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. Time to go on to the next stage where we perfect this. And brothers and sisters, remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one of the most powerful things you could do. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, من شغله ذكري عن مسألتي. He says, whoever is too busy with remembering me from asking me, then I shall give him more than what I give to those who ask. So if you have that mentality, right, of doing stuff and doing all of your ibadah to please Allah and gain nothing out of it, wallahi, then you will be successful, brothers and sisters. So keep your tongues moist with the remembrance of Allah. Keep your tongues moist with the remembrance of Allah, for only then will your heart find peace. And get yourselves into this habit of always getting better and always improving and finding new sunnahs to do and finding new ways to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because those who realize this, when they worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with this mentality, expecting nothing in return, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He will take care of them from top to bottom, brothers and sisters. And in the second part of the khutbah, we'll talk more about that, inshallah. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم فيا فوز المستغفرين استغفروه. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد, brothers and sisters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, my servant continues drawing nearer to me with nawafil. with nawafil, voluntary acts that will get us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But notice, why is there a hatta there? Right? There is a hatta. Why does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He say a servant continues? Why doesn't He say just, a servant does his nawafil and then he attains my love? Right? Why? Because this is a process, brothers and sisters, that takes time, it takes discipline, and it takes mahabbah. It takes love. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He isn't going to show you that love if you don't have it for Him in the first place. Right? And mahabbah, brothers and sisters, love is a very interesting word in the Arabic language. And love comes from the word erase. Mahabbah comes from the word erase in the Arabic language. Why? Imam Abu Bakr al-Shibli, he says, لِأَنَّهَا تَمْحِي مِنَ الْقَلْبِ مَا سِوَاءَ الْمَحْبُوبِ. He says it erases everything from the heart except the one that you love. You ever heard love blinds? Love does blind, right? It erases everything but the person or being or entity or the idea that you love. And Ibn al-Qayyim, he says, people, there are stages to love. There are stages for love. And once you start falling in love with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you get to a certain stage, brothers and sisters, where Ibn al-Qayyim, he describes, he says, you get to a stage where the mentality or the only thing keeping you alive is مَا أُرِيدُ إِلَّا أَنْ أُرِيدُ مَا يُرِيدُ. I do not want except to want what He wants, who you love wants. So everything that you do becomes revolved around the one who you love. Everything that you guys do, that we do, becomes Allah-centric. You wake up, Ya Rabb, hamdu wa shukru kullu lak. You go to school, Ya Rabbi, I'm going to school for your sake. You go to work, Ya Rabb, I'm going to school for your sake. I'm going to work for your sake. You go to sleep, Ya Rabb, I hope I did good today. Please accept whatever good deeds I did and forgive me of my shortcomings. Every single little action that you do, you tie it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's how you know, brothers and sisters, you are in a good place. You are in a good place, inshallah. So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us of those who really truly love Him. And then, brothers and sisters, when you focus on that, and you do your obligatory and your voluntary acts, and you do it with discipline and with consistency and with sincerity and with mahabbah, right? Only then with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He would grant you His love. And that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, the continuation of the hadith, فَإِذَا أَحْبَبْتُهُ حَتَّى أُحِبَّهُ فَإِذَا أَحْبَبْتُهُ كُنْتُ سَمْعَهُ الَّذِي يَسْمَعُ بِهِ وَبَصَرُهُ الَّذِي يُبْصِرُ بِهِ وَيَدَهُ الَّتِي يُبْطِشُ بِهَا وَرِجْلَهُ الَّتِي يَمْشِي بِهَا وَلَئِنْ سَأَلَنِي لَأَعْطِيَنَّهُ وَلَئِنْ اسْتَعَاذَنِي لَأُعِيذَنَّهُ. He said, when I love him, this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talking. He said, when I love this servant of mine, I become his hearing with which he shall hear, his sight with which he shall hear, his hands with which he shall hold, his feet with which he shall walk. And it doesn't stop there, brothers and sisters. He said, if he asks me anything, if the servant asks me anything, I'll give it to him. And if he seeks refuge in me, I'll grant him that refuge. Allahu Akbar. This is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talking, right? Whatever you will ask, it will be granted, just like that slave. And if you need refuge, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grant you it. And He'll be with you at all times. And He'll guide you to be better and to choose the best things in your life for you. Right? So strive hard, brothers and sisters, to attain the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The first step is obligations, the wajib. The second is the nawafil. And third is sincerity, consistency, and mahabbah. And by doing all of this, solely for His pleasure, then you will attain Allah's love. And ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ask Him for His love. Right? The Prophet ﷺ used to say, Allahumma arzuqni hubbak wa hubba man yuhibbuk wa hubba amalin yuqarribuni ila hubbik. Right? The Prophet ﷺ used to say, Oh Allah, I ask you that you love me, and I ask you for the love of those who love you, and to enable me to do everything that you love, right? That brings me closer to you. Right? And ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the status of wilayah. Ask him for the status of wilayah, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, He promises in the Quran, أَلَا إِنَّ أَوْلِيَاءَ اللَّهِ لَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. Though there will certainly be no fear for the close servants, for the awliya of Allah, nor will they grieve. Right? So brothers and sisters, the best time to start is now. We are in the sacred month of Rajab, where our Prophet, our beloved Prophet, he went to the heaven, and Salah was made obligatory, right? And Ramadan is knocking on the doors. So what better time to start than now, brothers and sisters? Start preparing yourselves for Ramadan by trying to attain that status that pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and that will get you endless rewards in this dunya and the next. Plant your seeds in this month, water it in Sha'ban, and let it blossom during Ramadan. Brothers and sisters, this dunya is very, very short. This dunya is very, 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 very short. It'll be over in a blink of an eye, right? So if we do not center it around Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and around seeking His pleasures, then wallahi, we are at a loss. Wallahi, we are at a loss. So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us of those who really truly want to seek His pleasure, and for those who want to seek His love. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us of those whom He loves. Whom He loves. Allahumma barik lana fi Rajab wa Sha'ban wa ballighna Ramadan. اللهم اغفر لنا وارحمنا وعافنا واعف عنا وتجاوز عن سيئاتنا. اللهم ادخلنا جنة الفردوس الأعلى مع الأبرار. اللهم اجعلنا من أوليائك الصالحين المقربين إليك. اللهم كن مع إخواننا المستضعفين في غزة. اللهم داوي جرحاهم وارحم موتاهم وتقبل شهداءهم. اللهم كن معهم ولا تكن عليهم. انصرهم يا رب العالمين وتقبل منهم يا أكرم الأكرمين. وصل اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم وأقم الصلاة.
الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
لا إله إلا الله. دائما أبدا لا إله إلا الله. استقيموا وتراصوا يرحمني ويرحمكم الله. Foot to foot, shoulder to shoulder, do not leave any gaps. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الرحمن الرحيم. مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم. صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. آمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أرأيت الذي يكذب بالدين فذلك الذي يدع اليتيم ولا يحض على طعام المسكين. فويل للمصلين الذين هم عن صلاتهم ساهون الذين هم يراءون ويمنعون الماعون. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، الرحمن الرحيم، مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم، صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. آمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح ورأيت الناس يدخلون في دين الله أفواجا فسبح بحمد ربك واستغفره إنه كان توابا. الله. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.